Hey y'all, and welcome to Politibrawl. My name is Brian, and Judge Jeanine absolutely explodes at Jessica Tarlov when she calls her a cheerleader for Putin. Let's dive in.
He didn't used to call Zelensky a dictator. He didn't used to say that his people hated him. He didn't used to say he had a 4% approval rating. He didn't used to say any of the total blasphemy that he's been throwing out there in the last few weeks. Elon Musk also on Twitter a couple days ago saying, I agree, to someone who said that the U.S. should get out of NATO and the UN.
Blasphemy.
These are all things. Is that bad? I couldn't come up with the right word.
It's funny.
Okay. Well, have a good chuckle at it. These are all things that Putin wants to hear. And you know that because his own spokesman, Peskov, said as much, said the rapidly changing U.S. foreign policy configurations largely coincides with our vision. Dmitry Medvedev, the insolent pig about Zelensky, finally got a proper slapdown in the Oval Office. Trump is right. The Kyiv regime is gambling with World War III. So if you are satisfying someone that we all agree is a dictator and authoritarian to that level, don't you think maybe the methods aren't that great? And that's not to say that we don't need to come to the table and say, this is what our peace plan is. These are the territorial lines that we are comfortable with. No one thinks that he's going back to a pre-2014 era. Zelensky himself doesn't think that.
I don't think it's smart, though, Jessica.
But you just made a case about it being
that somebody else might agree with your perspective. If that's what you believe, if Trump believes, there's no, okay, Putin doesn't want this war. Zelensky doesn't want this war. Trump doesn't want this. So they're all in agreement.
But they're not in agreement because this actually has to come down to the brass tacks of how that country gets split up.
And who holds the cards.
No. I get it.
Ain't Zelensky.
Big man, I get it. I heard it. Tommy Tuberville was on TV today saying this is about what Putin and Donald Trump want. This doesn't have to do with Zelensky. But guess what? There are millions of Ukrainians who would beg to differ. No, they're not dead.
Already
they don't
dead.
have a future with him. They do not have a future with Zelensky. Zelensky is dependent upon us.
Do you guys get what you're saying? You're just saying that a sovereign country.
Saying?
Yes, I do. Besides the blasphemy word, which maybe I shouldn't have used. I know exactly what I was saying.
It's time for Ukraine to start building and stop
part
the
of
killing.
Russia again.
Nobody's
That's what
making it part of Russia.
You're telling them you can't be part of NATO. You're telling them you don't get your territory back.
No, because that was agreed upon decades ago. And every decade they move closer and closer to Russia, NATO has. And the Crimea and everything else is a response to NATO.
Russia. NATO encroaching on them.
They are an independent country who believes, and I'm not pro-Russia at all.
Really?
But
it doesn't sound like that.
Don't give me that,
You
really.
Don't give me that.
Don't give me that. You know what? The truth is they stand for this, and they don't want NATO any closer, and it's been decades that that's been agreed to. And for
invaded
decades,
a sovereign nation and
do you remember
killed
3 years ago?
They've stolen their children.
Okay, 3 years ago.
1 second, Jessica. No.
3 years ago, I sat here and I said the Russian-Ukrainian thing is like a family fight across the street. We don't want to go over there and get in between a family fight. We did. It's 3 years later.
I'm still waiting to hear what Jessica's plan is to remove Russia from eastern Ukraine.
What?
We haven't heard that yet from you. So until you tell us what your peace deal is, I think this is probably the better deal.
Really?
Jessica, how are you going to get the Russians out of eastern Ukraine?
You make a deal
if the
with
Ukrainians
them.
you make a deal with them.
But the deal is not giving up all of Ukrainian territory and calling him a dictator when he's clearly not.
You know what?
Okay, so how do you get them to stop fighting and get Russia to leave the country?
I don't know.
I don't know is your answer.
Tarlov is smart enough to know when something is unjust. Okay, this is an unjust war. Let's start off with that obvious point. Russia was the aggressor. But now we've got to scale back and start asking ourselves, why would Russia invade? Okay, they have been poked and prodded ever since the fall of the Soviet Union. And remember, let's go back even farther. You can always trust a Russian to be paranoid. That's literally Russian history in a nutshell. You've got the Huns and the Cossacks and the Mongols coming in from the east and from the south. You've got the Polish and the Lithuanians invading from the west. You've occasionally got the Turkish who will have incursions on the Black Sea. You've got a nation that's literally beleaguered on all sides. And you know what they have to deal with directly north? Polar bears and ice. Okay? If that is not a recipe for paranoia, I don't know what is. And so Russia is paranoid that that NATO is going to invade them one day. And on one hand, that's a ridiculous thing to do. Why would Europe throw its young people, which they have increasingly less of, into the meat grinder that is historically any sort of Russian campaign? And just for lack of a better word, never get involved in a land war in Asia. And also, the United States would have no interest in the war, because if they did, we would have done so after World War II. We would have turned the Cold War into a hot war. This is not something that is within the actual realm of possibility. After all, the fear of something is often greater than the threat itself. That's sort of a mantra throughout world history, but let's then scale back and then ask, what does Ukraine want? Well, Ukraine wants their independence, okay? But Russia is already in about 20% of Ukraine's territory. Ukraine has been begging for help from all over the world. They've received that help, and now it's a slow, slogging trench warfare, but the Ukrainians are still on the back foot. No one is coming out smelling like a rose in this conflict, and that includes us here in the United States. And so the best way forward for peace is for Ukraine to cede some of its territory, for Russia then to pay for that territory and pay in perpetuity to Ukraine, with more concessions of, if Ukraine ever gets invaded again by Russia, you have all these other nations lined up to give guaranteed aid and maybe even troop supports, something along those sort of lines. And that's always window dressing, because let's be real, a contract is just a piece of paper particularly when it comes to a foreign treaty. But when you actually want peace, you want your leaders to actually be in pursuit of that. And what we saw on Friday is Zelensky trying to make even more demands on President Trump, and oh boy, did that backfire. It backfired so bad that he was forced to release a statement like this. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky has said in his Oval Office meeting last week with President Donald Trump did not go the way it was supposed to, describing the fiery meeting as regrettable. Gee, you'd think. And nothing that Ukraine is ready to negotiate about an end to the conflict. Ugh, this ain't too good for Zelensky now, is it? I would like to reiterate Ukraine's commitment to peace, Zelensky said on X, addressing his remarkable sit-down with Trump directly. Trump and Vice President J.D. Vance berated Zelensky during the meeting, angrily accusing him of gambling with World War III and telling him, your country is in big trouble. Well, where's the lie? And then finally, in our meeting in Washington at the White House on Friday, did not go the way it was supposed to be. It is regrettable that it happened this way. It's time to make things right. We would like future cooperation and communication to be constructive. Translation, Zelensky realized that, I've made a big mistake in poking the bear on the other side of the Atlantic. Or in this case, the bison. Let's be honest, the American animal should be a bison. It shouldn't be the bald eagle, but eagles are still kind of cool, so I guess we're stuck with that. But you literally poked a 2,000-pound bison, and you wonder why it's turning its head and threatening to smash your vehicle, which that almost happened to me once. Seriously, do not poke the bison. Don't pet the fluffy cows. So ultimately, Zelensky knows that peace is going to be his best option for his nation. But he also knows that independence is going to come with concessions. That's the sad truth. And Tarlov doesn't quite really wrap her head around this because, again, it's the problem of morality. And this is a problem that a lot of politicians have, and it's not a bad problem to have. Okay, it's good to be a very moral politician. That means your values are much more centered and much more squared. But the reality is, we live in an ugly, disgusting, fallen world. We have got to play within those confines. So you've got to play in the realm of the realpolitik. And Zelensky messed around with the United States and found out the hard way. And now he's being forced to come back to the negotiating table. And now, once again, the minerals deal is back up and ready to run again as soon as Zelensky apologizes for his egregious behavior. So now we really need to ask ourselves, will Russia take what's being offered? Well, it's also going to require us to lift some sanctions, but let's be real here. As long as Russia feels threatened, which is, again, a ridiculous thing, as long as Russia feels threatened, they're going to continue to do very dumb, very weird things on foreign policy. That's the problem with the near abroad. And so in order to fix that problem, you've got to make peace dollarable, okay? You've got to make it economically viable for Ukraine. You've got to make it economically viable for Russia. But since we've been dragged into this, since we've been dragged into the family fight across the street, well, guess what? We now need to make it tolerable for ourselves as well. Everyone deserves peace, but we also deserve to get something out of that peace. And that's what basic negotiations are for, and that's what Jessica Tarlov really can't wrap her mind around. So bless her heart, she's trying her best. We appreciate that she's on Fox News, but the reality is, Greg Gutfeld's right to make jokes. Jesse Waters has a great point, and of course, you don't insult Judge Jeanine and live to tell about it. Folks, my name is Brian. Hope you enjoyed that segment here on Politibrawl. Don't forget to like and subscribe. Catch you on the next one, and until then, y'all have a good one.